Today is Rosh Hashanah, which is also known as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. According to Maimonides, the great medieval sage from Spain and Egypt, today is the day when the world stands poised between innocence and guilt, as if there is a great scale of judgment before us. If we commit a sin, then that will tilt the scale against our fate and the fate of the world. Yet if we commit a good deed, it will tilt the scale in that positive direction as well. I want you to imagine for a moment that scale has come to life. That instead of this sermon right now, upon this bima is that scale. And that we are forming a line, one by one, to come up to that great scale of judgment in order to be judged. The question before us is, would you join that line? Well, I don't know about you, but I would wonder, why would I ever want to join that line? I mean, come on. Why would I ever choose to make my most private self open for cross-examination without a lawyer present to defend me? In other words, why would I ever choose to become that vulnerable? And if you were to do so, if you were to risk exposing your most private self, it's because you know that vulnerability is the key to building a life of love and connection with one another, with God, and with ourselves. Think about someone close to you. How do you know you're close with them? Really? Have you shared with them your secrets? Do they know your fears? If you shared a moment that's not made for Facebook or Instagram? Chances are that if you've ever taken the leap to go from being an acquaintance to becoming a close friend, or if you've ever gone from being a close friend to becoming a life partner, if you've ever said, I love you to someone, chances are that you have shared something that is dear and precious to you, and you pray that it is dear and precious to them as well. When God took the rib out of Adam in order to form Eve, God integrated that rib into Eve's body as if to say that his insides should become a part of hers, which leads Adam to say, you are bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Imagine what it would be like if you could think of someone else's vulnerability as a part of our own flesh. How careful we would be with it. But that's the scary part. Because we don't know for sure if they'll be careful with our vulnerability, just like we don't know if we're going to be careful with theirs. Because by definition, being vulnerable means that we become capable of being wounded by our friends, our lovers, our partners, our confidants, who take what we share out of love and use it to harm us, to ridicule us, to shame us, or just to ignore us. And if or when that happens, it makes us wonder if we can trust someone enough to be vulnerable again. As Dr. Brené Brown, a researcher on shame and vulnerability, writes in her book, Daring Greatly, vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. When someone does not mutually share their vulnerability with you, or if they violate yours, it makes you question their trustworthiness. But therein lies the rub and the paradox. Because you can't be vulnerable with someone you can't trust, but you won't know if someone is trustworthy until you're vulnerable with them. In thinking about that paradox, I want to take some time today, on this day of Rosh Hashanah, to think about God's relationship with humanity. Because at least according to one tradition, today is the anniversary of God's creation of humanity. Simply put, when God created humanity, God became vulnerable. God took a chance in creating us. As the Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks says, creation inescapably involves risk. And for God, that was true of only one act of creation, namely the making of humankind. Especially because God had to limit God's power in order to give us free will and the ability to choose. This means that God was taking a risk in creating us because our behavior then could be uncontrollable and we could end up wounding God. The angels, at least according to one midrash, understood this risk and they told God, don't do it. Don't create humanity. Do you know what they're going to do to you? Do you know what they're going to do to themselves? All the harm that they're going to cause to this world, it's not worth it. Don't create them. But you know what? The amazing thing is God did not listen. No. God did not listen for one reason and one reason only. Because God wanted to love us. Because God wanted to connect with us. And so God was willing to be vulnerable with us and for us. That is the only reason why we are here today. And what have we done with God's vulnerability? Have we cared for it as if it's a part of our own flesh? No, we haven't. Adam and Eve took from the fruit from the Garden of Eden, even though God told them not to. And then their son Cain, he created murder by killing his brother Abel. And then soon afterwards, God nearly had to destroy all of humanity because of our wickedness with a flood. And even after that, our ego got so big that we decided to raise a tower up to heavens to become like God with the Tower of Babel, only for God to have to say, stop. This is not why I created you, and struck it down. Time and time again, humanity has failed to uphold God's trust in us. And that's only within the first few generations of our existence. If you take a look at the history of humanity up until the present day, it is not hard to see how time and time again we have failed to uphold God's vulnerability in loving us. It is as if God is stepping up to the scale of judgment each year on Rosh Hashanah to bear God's vulnerability for loving us. And each year we judge God's vulnerability with harshness and ridicule because of the way we treat ourselves and one another with harshness and ridicule. So that should mean God should quit being vulnerable with us because God can't trust us, right? But the amazing thing is, God does not quit on us. Though we seem to be untrustworthy, God's love is steadfast. Brown says, love is uncertain. It's incredibly risky. And loving someone leaves us emotionally exposed. Yes, it's scary, and yes, we open ourselves to being hurt. But can you imagine a life without being loved or loving someone? No. God cannot imagine life without loving humanity. So after the flood, God does something completely counterintuitive. God promises never to destroy humanity again, even though the possibility that we will not uphold God's vulnerability is still there. And with this in mind, then Maimonides was wrong. Each year on Rosh Hashanah, when we come up to the scales of judgment, the world's fate does not hang in the balance because God promised that the world would not be destroyed after the flood. No. What hangs in the balance, what is on trial when we decide to step up to the scales is not our fate or the fate of the world, but rather the fate of God's faith in us. That is what is being judged today on the anniversary of God's creation of humanity. And as we decide whether to step up to the scales, we are not only being asked to care for God's vulnerability, but also, as is important in any loving relationship, if we are willing to be vulnerable with God. I want to take a step back here for a moment, because in the past few minutes I've been talking a lot about God. And what's so fascinating about this idea that God created us with a sense of free will by limiting God's own power is that because of that decision, God creates the possibility, really the eventuality, that there will be people who will not believe in God or who will struggle with their faith in God. So while many of us have a faith, there are many of us who are really struggling with it or who don't have that faith. There are people in our community who have gone through experiences in which they think, how could a caring God allow me to go through something like this? People who have come up to the scales of judgment to bear their vulnerability to God, only for God to judge them with harshness and ridicule. And it was just too much. That's why it's so brilliant, that whether they intended to or not, our sages instituted a Torah reading for this day of Rosh Hashanah. And it's Torah reading to help us find a connection to the service of Rosh Hashanah, to this moment. Because the Torah is not a story about God, it's a story about humanity. It's a story about us, about our ups and downs, about our vices and virtues. And when we look at today's Torah reading, I think we'll notice that Sarah, Abraham, and Hagar struggles with their vulnerability mimic our struggles with vulnerability as well. And that by looking at their struggles, we can not only see how it could help us in our own, but that, amazingly enough, God's character can be redeemed and be made meaningful, even for those of us who have our doubts. Sarah, Abraham, and Hagar all feel vulnerable in ways we should recognize. Sarah struggles with her sense of self-worth because she cannot get pregnant at all. Abraham struggles with being torn between two warring sides of his family. And Hagar struggles with the loneliness of being a stranger, wondering who is going to be there to protect her and her children. Perhaps we've experienced forms of these kinds of vulnerability as a result of infertility, as a result of family drama, or as a result of being a stranger. Or perhaps we felt other kinds of vulnerability as a result of a decline in our health, as a result of the loss of a loved one, or something else. But regardless of the cause of our vulnerability, what we should recognize the most in Sarah, Abraham, and Hagar's experiences with theirs is that being vulnerable is painful, very painful. Sarah lashes out at Hagar. Abraham becomes distressed, and Hagar calls out and cries. Because vulnerability is painful, it is hard for others to really understand what we're going through. And we bear the brunt of our pain alone. And even if we share that sense of vulnerability with others, can we really expect them to understand exactly what we're going through? I mean, come on. The worst thing that someone can tell you is, I know exactly how you feel. Really? Really? You know exactly how I feel? You know exactly what it's like to feel like I don't deserve to be a father because I can't have a child? You know exactly what it's like to feel like that I have to choose between two different parts of my family? Do you know exactly what it feels like to be a stranger in which no one seems to want me, no one seems to care about me? No, you can't. Empathy is such an inexact science, and we cannot expect to simply take away someone else's pain. The only one who can understand our pain, who can feel it exactly like we do, is either in here or in here. It is the voice in our heads and in our hearts, the voice that hears everything, the voice that we can't escape from. When we experience the pain of vulnerability, that voice is the first one to respond to us, to reply to those emotions. We can call that voice our conscience, We can call it our spirit. We can call it whatever we want. But in the biblical and Jewish imagination, that voice is the same voice as God's. V'kol demama daka yishama. That we can hear the still small voice of God within us. So when we express our vulnerability, how will our inner voice respond? Well, our tradition teaches us that since that voice is the voice of God's, then that voice will respond to our vulnerability with love and kindness. When Abraham expressed his hurt, that voice responded by saying, "Don't be distressed." When Hagar cried out, that voice said, "Fear not." Yes, there are other voices in our heads, some harsher than others. But Judaism teaches us that positive self-talk is God talk. When our inner voice speaks with love and kindness, that is God's voice, because love is the only language that God knows how to speak to God's most cherished creation, humanity. In just a moment, the cantor is going to recite the Hineni, a personal prayer to God for guidance, strength, and direction as we begin the Musaf service. It is also the perfect prayer to recite if you want to approach the Bima to weigh the weight of your deeds and your good deeds and your mistakes on the great scale of judgment. And as such, the cantor will be reciting the prayer as he walks up to the Bima. And as he walks up, he will recite, "Here I stand impoverished in merit, trembling in the presence of the one who hears the prayers of Israel. Even though I am unfit and unworthy for the task, I come to represent your people and plead on their behalf." This is a prayer soaked in vulnerability, as the cantor is willing for God to peer into his soul and weigh his faults and merits with discernment. But it is more than the cantor's personal prayer of vulnerability. It is a call for us to offer our prayers of vulnerability. We stand at attention as the melody and the words permeate the air with a heaviness that makes us imagine that the letters of the prayer are being placed upon the scales on our behalf. And drawing its power from our attention, the Hineni removes the armor we wear to hide our vulnerability so that we can bear it before God, even if we're in the midst of a struggle with God. As our armor is stripped away by the resounding melody, we can feel the pain of our vulnerability rising up within us. For a moment, we're fearful. We don't want to let it out, but we can't hide it any longer. This hallowed prayer won't let us. It forces our pain to the surface as we allow our Maker to see what he made. And as we let go of controlling that pain, as we engage with and embrace our vulnerability, something amazing happens. We find the courage to take a step forward toward the scales with our own personal prayers of vulnerability. A courage that is strengthened as we look around the room and notice that fellow members of our community are walking forward with their personal prayers of vulnerability as well. And with every step forward we take together, we feel God's love embracing us. It doesn't mean the pain is gone. It is still hard to bear. But now we know that leaning into our vulnerability will not make us weak. It will make us strong. It will not shame us. It will empower us. The compassion, we may be in pain, but we are no longer in fear. The compassion that God promises us on the Day of Atonement is present now on the Day of Judgment because we are willing to present ourselves to be judged by God, thus rewarding God's faith in us. And as the final words and the melodies of the Hineni wash over us, inspiring our personal prayers of vulnerability, we can sense a joy that will last with us long after we leave this hallowed hall. A joy that comes when we step up to the scales fully, without hesitation. A joy that is soaked in a profound sense of love and connection to our very own existence, because we are willing to be vulnerable. Shana Tova.